I'm speaking with M.R. Carey, author of The Book of Koli, published by Hachette Book Group. It was on sale April 14th, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So first, as with any writer, I'm sure you have a ton of ideas that are bubbling around in your head. How did the idea for this particular book rise above the rest and get written?
It started in much the same way as Girl with All the Gifts started, which is to say, I did a short story, and the short story was off to one side of what became the novel. But it gave me a chance to play with the voice. So you could say that Koli's voice was the thing that came first, although in the short story, the corresponding character is called Carey, and that character is a little bit like an amalgam of Koli and Cup in the novel. But I got hung up on the voice, and I sort of built the character around the voice, and then I built the world around the character. It was a strange but a very sort of rewarding process.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you usually, when you write shorts, I don't know how often you write short stories, but do you write them with the idea, can this become a novel, or is it usually segregated and this one kind of rose up and you felt like this could be a novel length story?
I never go in sort of assuming that I'm sort of trialing something for a novel, but I think one of the things I love about the short story form is that it allows you to play games with voice and tone and style and approach, and to do things that you wouldn't normally do in a longer piece, because if it doesn't work out, there's much less at stake. So it can be a kind of laboratory for different ways into a story, and sometimes you just find yourself in a really fertile space, and you think there's more to this.
Tell me about the book then, protagonist, setting, that sort of thing, however many details you'd like to go into.
Sure. So this is I guess it's a post-apocalyptic story. It takes place several centuries after the collapse of our global civilization. It's long enough that they don't really know exactly what happened. They have stories about what happened. They talk about the times before. They talk about the unfinished war, which was clearly a resource war. There was a time when climate breakdown had begun to take hold. Resources became scarce. There were wars fought for those diminishing resources. There were also scientific interventions to try to reverse what was happening to the world's climate and to the world's ecosystems. And those interventions, however well meant, caused further harm. So, for example, there was massive genetic manipulation, especially with plants, which has made some of the plants feral and mobile. They seeded the clouds with silver, and they seeded the sea with algal blooms to try and capture carbon, and all of those things have had an impact on the world that Koli knows. But he grows up in this very, very small corner of England, and because the environment is so hostile, nobody goes very far. He's literally lived his entire life in this one valley, the Calder Valley. And I guess it's a coming of age story. It's a story about how he discovers the greater world and his place in that world. And it's also a story about the relationship between humanity and the other things that are alive, if that doesn't sound too grandiose.
So I guess they live, at this point, the characters live in a sort of medieval type of setting, very low-tech kind of situation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. With the one exception that they have some pieces of legacy technology. There are a few things that have survived from our time, and they've survived because they were self-repairing. They have the ability to keep themselves in a functional condition, and they don't work for everybody. They recognize some users and not others. So in the village where Koli lives, Mithenrud, and in most of the other villages around about, the few pieces of legacy tech are hoarded and treasured, and the people who can use them have a kind of elite status within that society. And in Koli's village, when you reach the age of 15, you have your testing. You're allowed to pick up one of the pieces of ancient tech. And if it wakes in your hand and works for you, then you become a rampart. You become a member of this elite group that protects the village against external threats, and the world is your oyster, or rather this tiny little piece of the world is your oyster.
Mm-hmm. So is the book more about the characters in this setting, or does it address sort of social issues as far as the use of technology or the abuse of technology?
I think it's fair to say that those themes are definitely present in the story. The focus is on Koli, on his journey, and on the encounters that he makes along the way. But I think with any kind of writing, and I think this is true for every writer, your ideas and your attitudes and the way you see the world, it's always present in a sort of latent way in anything, whatever the ostensible subject is. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff here about our stewardship of the environment. There's a lot of stuff about power structures in society, and how they distort human relationships. There's a lot of my other sort of familiar bugbears and obsessions. There's a lot of stuff about family, about the way families kind of mediate the identity of individuals. So all of those things are in there, but in a kind of light touch way.
So though it's a fantasy book, or I guess could you call it science fiction in a sense, or yeah, I guess you could. It's science fiction
insofar as the explanation for everything that's happening is ultimately a scientific monologue. I'm stretching the definition of that in some cases. Some of the technology that we see is not technology of our time. It's technology that you have to hypothesize that these things came in at a certain point between now and the collapse of global civilization.
So it seems that the dangers that exist to the characters, to the protagonist, may seem fantastic in a sense, but I get the sense they're based on science gone wild or mad, or whatever word you'd like to use.
Yeah. We're seeing a world that has been the victim of multiple cataclysms, multiple overlapping disasters. And it takes a long time before you unravel all the things that happen. I mean, to a certain extent, that's kind of not where the main focus of the story is. But Koli does go on a journey of discovery. He does uncover the past in making his decisions about his own future. And he gets to encounter some of the surviving artifacts of the past, not just the little pieces of legacy tech in his home village, but much bigger structures that have survived from our time, which become more and more central to the story as it goes on.
Did you have to do any research as you wrote this?
A little bit, not a huge amount. I did some geographical research. I wanted the geography of the Calder Valley and the geography of Koli's journey to make sense, but that wasn't a huge deal. And I did some research into, for example, one of the characters, Ursula, who we meet in the first book, has a robot, a tame robot that follows along behind her, and it's a military robot. She calls it the Drudge. And it's like a horse with no head. It's a sort of big, bulky metal body and 4 spindly metal legs, and a little gun mounted amidships, as it were. And that's based on existing technology. Those robots are being trialed now by the U.S. Army, and we've seen some quite scary footage of what the prototypes look like and what they can do. So I looked at that footage, and I looked at the sort of what we know about the specification of those particular machines. But an awful lot of it is just invented by whole cloth, as it were. I guess the other thing I looked at are the proposed scientific Hail Marys. The things that are being discussed as possible last-ditch interventions if the climate really starts to fold up and fall apart.
I'm speaking with M.R. Carey, author of The Book of Koli. You can find more information about his work on Twitter at Michael Carey 191. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my newsletter located at crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or the episode on Facebook at Cris Alvarez FCN or on YouTube at Cris Alvarez. You can contact me directly on Twitter at Cris Alvarez FCN or on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi. If you like military history, please listen to my podcast Military History Inside Out, located at warscholar.org and militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you like outer space business, technology, and policy, please listen to my podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also located at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. I appreciate any support you can give me. Now back to the podcast. Were there, do you have other works that you've done that fall in the same vein as this novel? Like, are there, what other stuff have you done that maybe follows this same scene or a post-apocalyptic that maybe this is built on?
Well, the most obvious example would be The Girl with All the Gifts, and then its companion novel, The Boy on the Bridge, where again, you've got a society that has fallen apart, in this case because of a plague. Mm-hmm. Those are zombie novels, but they're plague zombie novels. That is to say, there's nothing supernatural going on. There's a pathogen, in this case a fungus, a mind-controlling fungus, which turns people into, it shuts down your higher brain functions and basically just turns you into a feral, hungry, completely out of control. So I wrote two novels set in that world, and I also wrote the screenplay for the movie based on the first of those books, Girl with All the Gifts. Mm-hmm. Apart from that, I haven't really done much in post-apocalyptic territory. Mm-hmm. But it has to be said, my comfort zone is speculative fiction. It's the whole broad spectrum that goes from horror through dark fantasy into sci-fi and even into magic realism. What I can't do ever, it seems, is work in a totally realistic vein. It feels like I'm painting in black and white rather than in color when I do that.
So what books, music, TV, and maybe other media inspire you and the work you do?
Oh, there would be a huge list there. The stuff that I'm completely addicted to at the moment is Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy, Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and The Mirror and the Light. I'm just in awe of those books. You can reread them endlessly, and they just keep on giving. Her style it's like liquid honey. You just devour it. I grew up reading a lot of genre fictions. I guess the first author who sort of took me down that road was Enid Blyton, with her fantasy stories about the magic wishing chair and the faraway tree, which was a tree that if you climbed it took you into different magical lands. And then as I grew older, I discovered Michael Moorcock, Roger Zelazny, Ursula Le Guin, Vonda McIntyre, Mervyn Peake. The Gormenghast trilogy was a huge influence on me. And at the same time, I was reading lots and lots of comics. So I grew up reading the Marvel comics. The first American comic I ever read was a Fantastic Four annual that my older brother gave me, and that started a kind of lifelong love affair with the Marvel superhero universe and with the DC one. More recently, I've read a lot of Tony Millionaire's Sock Monkey and Uncle Gabby comics. I love the Hernandez brothers stuff, Palomar and Love and Rockets, Mechanics and so on. Music, I listen to folk and the sort of folkier end of rock, which is it's a fairly narrow niche, but there's a lot of richness there.
Okay. So, having worked in both comic books and prose, comic books are very visual medium. When you write, do you see your the progression of your novel in comic book form, and you write down what you're seeing, or how do you translate or differentiate between the two and how you work?
Woo! Again, that's a huge question. I actually started out writing prose. I came to comics initially through writing comics journalism, and at the same time I was trying to write novels. And the reason why none of my novels ever got anywhere was because they were just completely lacking in structure. This is when I was in my teens and my 20s. I would write these massive, shapeless bags of story, just disastrously lacking in any kind of progression. My method of working was write chapter 1, make a cup of tea, come back, write chapter 2. I didn't plan. I didn't have any kind of a sense of where I was going. And then at a certain point, I started writing comics. And the thing about comics is that if you're writing for an American publisher in a periodical format, you have a very, very fixed page count, which might be 20 or 22 pages. You can't really go either beyond that or below it. So you have to obsess about structure. You have to cost out each scene in terms of pages, and you have to make sure that you don't run out of pages before you run out of story. Coming back from that into writing prose, I was able to use the freedoms of prose much more intelligently, and create structures of my own and create limits of my own. So comics were a fantastic proving ground for me. I guess comics are a very, very collaborative medium. I mean, typically you've got the writer, you've got a penciler, you've got an inker or finisher, a colorist, a letterer. There's a whole team of people who are putting that world together. And yes, you're right. In a novel, you're doing all of those things by yourself. But there's something glorious about that. I mean, you're in a novel, you're trying to create a sort of a space that is defined by all 5 senses. You try to invoke not just the visuals, but the sounds and the smells and the tastes and the textures and so on. And I think if you're doing that job well, you create a world that is just as immersive as a comic book world or a movie world. But it acts on the reader's brain in a different way, which is why I think when you see the adaptation of a book or a comic that you've really loved, and you see it being realized in TV or in a movie form, often you have the kind of the dislocation, the sort of dissociative sense of that's not what they look like, or that's not what that looks like, and you can't suspend your disbelief because you've already sort of created the world in your head.
How did you when you transitioned from being an unstructured writer to a structured one, how did you make that happen?
I think it happened to me. I was very lucky with my collaborators. I always have been. The first 2 editors that I worked for at DC were Elisa Whitney and Shelley Bond, or Shelley Roberg as she was in those days. And they are both, they're that magic fusion of detail and big picture. They don't let you get away with anything. Shelley in particular would actually insist on a very, very full scene breakdown for each issue. And she would pick a fight with me about things. She'd say that scene doesn't need to be 2 pages. You can get that done in 1 and have a splash page over there. And Elisa had studied narrative theory at college. And so she gave me a ton of stuff about the shapes of stories, the models and templates of stories that just opened my eyes to the potential of the medium in ways that I'd never thought about before. So it was a time of discovery. But I'd be lying if I said that I was the prime mover. I was getting a lot of input from really gifted people who had worked in the medium far longer than I had, and knew a lot more about it.
Were you resistant to change, or did you go along with it happily?
No, I devoured it. I think I was ready for it. I was ready to sort of to pick up this ball and run with it. And it was really exciting. I mean, this is when I was writing Lucifer and Hellblazer, and it felt like, and then sort of a little bit further down the line when I started to go back into novels again with the Felix Castor series, and it really felt like it was a a creative explosion, a kind of personal renaissance. I was learning my craft, and I was hugely relishing it.
So to step back to the Book of Koli, would you say it has a soundtrack of some sort, or does it have a specific aesthetic to it that you could describe?
There is a soundtrack that appears in the story, because one of the characters in the story is Monono Alvarez, who is a dead Japanese pop star, who Koli meets in the form of the artificial intelligence that hosts and curates the content on a music player. And she introduces him to the music of the past, the music of our time. Koli's tastes are not the same as my tastes. He listens to a lot of heavy metal. There's the Metallica in there and Pantera, stuff like that, which, to be honest, I do not listen to for pleasure very much. When I was writing it, the songs that went around in my head most often were from the Talking Heads album Naked. There's a lot of songs on that album that are about the breakdown of the world and the new world rising up, and kind of reflecting on whether people of our time have the wherewithal to make that transition, whether we would actually be able to survive in a world that was radically different from this one.
So currently, as you write your novels, is there anything you do out of the ordinary to complete your work?
Out of the ordinary in what kind of way, Chris?
Maybe how you write your drafts. Everyone says that you're either, what is it, a pants writer or a now I'm forgetting the other term. Writing from the seat of your pants or outlining.
Got you. So like kind of like the architect versus the gardener kind of thing. Whether you plan and plot or let things happen organically.
Right.
I kind of do a little bit of both. I still do what I used to do when I wrote comics, which is I still do very detailed outlines for each chapter in a story. So I always know where the major plot points are going to come. But then I always find when I start writing that I have better ideas. So the plan, what's that saying about no plan survives contact with the enemy? In this case, the enemy is the keyboard, I guess. As soon as you start writing, your mind starts to sort of like hover over the fictional space. You start to engage more with things that were just abstract ideas. You start to live inside characters who you had just sketched out. And things inevitably go in different directions. So the plan is there. And the plan is, after a while, the plan is just a safety net. You can go back to the plan if you want to. But typically, you're sailing away with the plan sort of off to one side of you. And then the book does its own thing. So there were a lot of things in Koli that I knew had to happen, and particularly the ending. I knew I was steering towards a particular crisis and a particular resolution, but there were many other things that got woven in, just because once you're writing it, your mind comes up with a bunch of stuff that hadn't occurred to you at the planning stage. So it's a combination of punctilious plotting and seat of the pants invention.
Has your and we touched on this a bit already, but has your approach to writing changed over time?
I think my voice has changed. I think I've always tended to write in the same way. I write. I'm not going to say 9 to 5 because it often goes on much longer than that. But I get out of bed in the morning and I sit down at the keyboard and I start to write. But I think what has changed is my voice. I think there was a time when I was writing the Casa novels and the couple of novels that followed them. I discovered a formula and I stuck to that formula, both in terms of the way the stories functioned and in terms of the storytelling voice and tone. And then what happened was I wrote 2 books. I co-wrote 2 books with my wife, Linda, and our daughter, Louise, The House of War and Witness and The City of Silk and Steel. And so for about 3 years, best part of 3 years, I was co-writing with 2 women who had very strong voices of their own. and approaches to story that were not the same as mine. And we had to compromise. We had to find working solutions that we were all comfortable with. We had to sort of converge on a voice that worked for all of us. And I came out of that in a different place. I came out sensitized to stuff that I used to do without thinking about it very much. And the immediate consequence of that was Girl with All the Gifts, where the protagonist is a 12-year-old girl. And I use present tense and very, very short declarative sentences and quite simplified vocabulary to try to get across the immediacy of experience to a child. The way when you're that age, any tiny thing can fill your whole landscape to bursting. I wanted to try and sort of get that across. And I've not looked back since then, really. I think I'm much more willing to mess around now, to experiment with something, not in the expectation that it will work, but out of curiosity as to where it will take me.
Have you done non-writing work that's influenced how or what you wrote? I guess we would go, you've been writing for a while, so you wouldn't have been doing any other work, but maybe there's something out there that did influence you?
Well, I worked as a teacher for 15 years. Before I was going to say before I started writing, but actually I was writing as a hobby throughout that time. And I gave up teaching in 1999-2000, that academic year, because I got to the point where I was turning down writing gigs in order to teach, and I thought, but actually writing is what I love. I think teaching was a discipline, and teaching, one of the things about the job is that you meet 200 new people every year, and I did it for 15 years. So I think it gives you an enormous resource bank of human nature. You learn a lot about people and how they tick. I mean, it's not unique in that respect. There are many jobs that are equally valuable. But I think that was one of the things I got from teaching. I think also teaching has left me with a sort of a fascination for the way social role interacts with personality, because what you do becomes who you are to a certain extent. It becomes grafted onto you. When you teach, when you go into a classroom, you have a position of authority and a position of power over a group of impressionable young people, and it's something that is easier to pick up than to put down. I used to find myself, if I was out with friends in the evening and then we were having a conversation, I'd do the thing that teachers do in a classroom. I'd point to somebody to say, "Yes, it's your turn to talk." And I realized at that point, you kind of all through your life, you're taking on grafts. There is your core personality, but your core personality is always inflected by the things that you do, by the rituals of your life. The Stanford prison experiment, where students were asked to be either prisoners or prison guards, and they had to call it off because the prison guards were just like getting into it too much and doing some frankly sadistic things. It's like that, right? Yeah, it's more subtle for most of us, but I think it's there, and I think that plays through in a lot of my stories as well. People enacting roles or rebelling against the roles that are assigned to them.
Did you find it when you were a teacher? Were there times when you thought to yourself you wanted to do one thing, but you said, I have to be the teacher, and so I have to behave in this other way in order to do the right thing?
You definitely find yourself. I mean, you're within an institution. You're Pink Floyd said, another brick in the wall, which I think is the negative way of saying that. But you're part of an institution, and all institutions, whatever their ostensible purposes, they also exist to further themselves. There are structures within any institution, whether it's a school or an office or whatever, that just exist because they reinforce the power structures within that organization. And you definitely find that seeping into you. You find yourself reacting with institutional mind rather than your own personal mind. I can pride myself on one thing. I was a terrible manager. I mean, I did become a head of department at one of the colleges I worked in, and I wasn't good at the job. And one of the reasons why I wasn't good at it was because I continued to regard management as the enemy, even when I was a manager. My headmaster asked me if I had trouble with all authority or only with his. And at the time, I thought, no, it's just you. But I think he was probably onto something. I'm definitely with Groucho Marx in that I would never want to be in any club that would have me as a member.
I'm speaking with M.R. Carey, author of The Book of Koli. You can find more information about his work on Twitter at MichaelCarey191. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my newsletter located at CrisAlvarez.com or FullContactNerd.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or the episode on Facebook at Cris Alvarez FCN or on YouTube at Cris Alvarez. You can contact me directly on Twitter at Cris Alvarez FCN or on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi. If you like military history, please listen to my podcast Military History Inside Out, located at warscholar.org and militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you like outer space business, technology, and policy, please listen to my podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also located at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. I appreciate any support you can give me. Now back to the podcast. You know, it's interesting you said that family is a theme that you explore in your work. I would imagine as a teacher, you might see groups of students, you see all kinds of power structures there, including students forming into their little sort of semi-family groups in a sense, maybe not by blood, but by other things. So that seems like just that experience, you could really see power structures and how they work.
Very much so. Yeah, and also you see families that support their kids, and you see families that sabotage their kids without ever knowing that they're doing it. That just won't let them be the person they want to be or do the things they want to do. Mm-hmm. So you see it when it works, and you see it when it's turned toxic and dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm. Were there parts of the book you had to take out that the editors did? Are you the type that writes a lot and then cuts back, or how is that with this book?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I can answer it. I'm trying to think what was the editing process like. I think it was fairly light this time. I think the final draft is very close to the first draft. There were definitely some sequences that I wrote and took out myself, not because my editors didn't like them, but because they weren't conducive to the sort of forward motion of the story. There was a bunch of stuff about the other villagers in the Calder Valley. Mm-hmm. And I realized at a certain point, yes, but I'm trying to emphasize the isolation. The more I sort of show these other places at work, the more that sense of isolation is diluted. So I cut back on that quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a person or people reading as you go along to identify these things, or that was just stuff as you kept doing it, you figured that out?
This time I used my family a lot as beta test readers, much more so than with previous novels. I'm not sure quite why that was, but they stepped into the breach, and I can remember having conversations both with Lynn and with our kids about certain sequences, and also about the way the world is revealed, and whether the reveals have been timed effectively or not. Mm-hmm. As I say, it opens up like a sort of set of Chinese boxes, and it gets bigger as it goes. So I had a lot of support and help from my family.
Okay, so now a bit of a whimsical question. When you were young, was there any power, technology, or fictional setting that you wanted or yearned for?
Power, technology, or fictional setting. I fantasize myself into a lot of fictional settings, all the time. Right back to when I was a little kid, the wishing chair in the faraway tree. I would have given a major organ to have access to either of those things. I fantasized about having superpowers. I decided quite early on that teleportation, like Nightcrawler, is the superpower to have. It's the primo superpower.
Mm-hmm.
Technology. I would have loved to have a power ring like Green Lantern. It has a lot of useful functionality to it.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of settings, the Earthsea, the archipelago in Earthsea with all the tiny islands, each of which has its own separate civilization. I used to fantasize about that a lot.
Oh wow! Okay.
I did live. I've always been I was always the kind of kid who lived inside his own head a lot.
Okay. Were there any difficulties in getting the book finished or published?
Well, the Koli books. No, I mean, I'll tell you one thing. After Girl with All the Gifts, I'd written 9 novels before Girl with All the Gifts. Girl with All the Gifts sold much, much better than all of the novels that had preceded it. In fact, it's outsold all of those previous novels collectively. After that, and after I started using the M.R. Carey pseudonym, my publishers started to look at me much more closely because the works were selling on a level that merited that degree of scrutiny. They became much more conscious of me as a brand, and they wanted me to carry on writing books that were on brand, that kind of work in the same way as Girl with All the Gifts. And it's not like they wanted me to just carry on writing, pastiching that same formula, but they wanted me to carry on writing in that same space. So I found myself getting a much higher rate of rejections, paradoxically. I'd suggest a possible outline for a story, and they're saying, but that doesn't feel like an M.R. Carey story. That feels a lot more like the kind of thing that Mike Carey would write. One time I was doing a reading in Oxford, and I bumped into Claire North, and I was bewailing my lot and saying, this is frustrating. I want to try this out or that out, and I keep getting told no, it's not on brand. And she said, well, it's your own fault. If you pitch, then you're allowing the publishers to say yes or no. What you do is you write the book, and you say, would you like to publish this? So with Koli, when the idea for Koli came into my head, I thought, this is going to be really hard to explain, but it'll be really easy for people to get it if I write the book. So I wrote like 40,000 words. I wrote a big chunk of work in progress and gave it to my editors and said, it will be that. And fortunately they said, yeah, okay, we like that. Do it as a trilogy. But that was a first for me, sort of like sneaking past their guard in that way.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. Interesting. What's your so you've been referring to the books? Is this so? The Book of Koli is the first in a series.
Yep.
But are you saying you've written the others as well, or you just plotted them out, or?
No, I've written all 3. I wrote them. I wrote all 3 books in the space of just over a year. They came out very fast, I think, because I had a really strong idea of where I was going with it. So the second one comes out in September, and the third one comes out next March or April. It's sort of bang, bang, bang.
Oh, wow. Okay. So have you started on a new writing project? Anything you can talk about or want to?
I'm noodling with a couple of things. I'm working with 2 incredibly gifted people and great collaborators, Colin McCarthy and Camille Gatan, who were the director and producer on Girl with All the Gifts, and we're putting together another movie idea. So I've been working on that. I'm working on a new novel, which is a fairly classic ghost story in some ways, but with a couple of tweaks and twiddles. And I'm working with Lynn and the kids on a sort of shared universe anthology. We've come up with an idea for a very strange world, and we're all writing short stories set in that world. And because there are so many of us, we reckon if we each write 4 or 5 stories, we'll have a book. it may never get published. It might just be the sort of thing that we give to family and friends, but that's helping us to stay sane during lockdown.
Mm-hmm. So with all the writing you do you find that social media is a distraction, or does it help you with your work?
I don't do it very much anymore. I parted company with Facebook around about the time of the Cambridge Analytica revelations. The only times I go on Facebook now really are for direct messaging, to respond to messages. I still go on Twitter quite a lot because I find Twitter is a great source of information on a lot of things. The people in my feed will often sort of provide links to newspaper articles or academic pieces that are fascinating and that can spark ideas. And it gives me the sense of belonging to a community where mostly I work by myself in a tiny room. So I guess I've never let it become that much of a distraction. Having said that, my big distraction at the moment is online gaming. There's a site called Board Game Arena, and there's another site called itsyourturn.com. Mm-hmm. So I play quite a lot of board games and quite a lot of games of chess and checkers online, which is my big tension release and my big distraction. And I do it too much.
What are some of your couple of your favorite board games on there?
Seven Wonders.
Oh, okay.
Is a marvelous card game where you're putting together a civilization by collecting sets of cards, and it plays very, very quickly on Board Game Arena. You can get through an entire game in 10 minutes, so that's quite addictive. And there's a German game called Six Nimmt, or Sechs Nimmt, which is it's a set of cards numbered from 1 to 104, and there are rules as to how you can play them in sequences to sabotage other people and force them to collect points. Those are my two favorites.
Interesting. Yeah, I played Seven Wonders in physical form. I guess it makes sense they could put it right on online.
Do you ever use the Board Game Geek site, Cris?
I'm familiar with it. I go sometimes to find information.
There are a number of expansions for Seven Wonders which were created by fans, not by Antoine Bowser himself, but Antoine Bowser has blessed them and has said that they're not stealing his intellectual property. And some of them are amazing. There's one called Ruins, and there's one called, I think it might be called Sailors, which allows you to interact with players who are not your neighbors, players elsewhere in the circle.
Sure.
And all of the pieces are downloadable. You can print and play.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Wow. That's cool information. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm seriously into this stuff.
Hey, no, I understand. I get it. Actually, are you familiar with Gen Con?
No.
Oh, that's the D&D, the big annual D&D convention. Basically, it's all kinds of games, but it started out as a D&D, Dungeons and Dragons convention back in the day, back in the 70s.
Right.
Yeah. So
is that in the US?
Yeah, it's in Indianapolis. I don't know if it jumps around, but usually it's around that area. But they premiere a lot of games there. That's like the big one of the big ones.
I do enjoy D&D. Both my daughter and her partner are DMs, so we've usually got a couple of campaigns going, or we did have until lockdown. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty good. I think Dragon Con is another big one. I think they have a lot of games premiered there as well in Atlanta. So yeah, that's the two big ones I can think of.
Right.
So you just mentioned some of your online or Twitter. Where can people find you online? Do you have a web page or?
I don't. I mean, I used to have a web page that was maintained by a friend, but I was shockingly negligent in providing content for it, so that's kind of hit the rocks. So really, it's only Twitter. I'm nominally on Facebook as well, but as I say, it's only for DMs, for responding to direct messages. So Twitter and Orbit, my UK publishers, maintain a page that just has news about new stuff coming out. But that's all really. Oh, and Goodreads. I'm on Goodreads.
Okay. Did you want to provide the your handle on either of those?
I would if I could remember it. I think on Twitter I'm just Michael Carey 191,
Okay.
which is what I am on Skype as well. I'm not sure about Goodreads. I think in Goodreads you just go to my author page, which is MR Carey.
Okay. Okay. I'll double check that and put the link in the show notes for the episode to make sure that
Cool.
that's correct.
Thank you.
That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
There's one other thing I'd like to plug.
Sure.
I did a comic book earlier this year, last year and early this year for DC, for the Hill House Comics imprint, which was created by Joe Hill.
Mhm.
My comic was called The Dollhouse Family, and it gets a collected edition in September. I was really proud of how it came out. It was I was collaborating with some of my favorite artists,
Mhm.
and I just think the story really came together well. So please check it out.
And you said September is when it comes out? Is it?
Yep,
Okay. And you said which publisher again?
DC Hill House.
Okay. Okay, definitely. All right. Well, thanks so much for speaking with me.
It's a great pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for listening. You can find more interesting information like this on chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. You can also find the podcast on your favorite podcast feed under the title Full Contact Nerd. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please remember to rate this podcast. It really helps. We're on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on YouTube under Cris Alvarez, on Facebook under Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and on Twitter at Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd. Don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.